Operating exposure, as I said earlier, can result from a conversion effect or a competitive effect or both. Conversion effect is similar to what we saw in transaction exposure, except that in the case of operating exposure, it includes cash flows not yet contracted for, and it reflects the impact of change in the domestic currency value of a foreign currency cash flow. Competitive effect, on the other hand, is far more complex and reflects the impact of changes in quantity and price not in line with the fluctuations in exchange rates. Let's look at some spreadsheet examples to understand this in some detail. Let's look at the case of an Indian producer of carpets exporting these carpets to the United Kingdom. Let's look at some assumptions that we've made in looking at this problem. The inflation in the United Kingdom is 3%, inflation in India is 8%. The current price at which the Indian exporter is able to export his carpets to the United Kingdom importer is 247.20 GBP per carpet. The prevailing exchange rate is 90.17. 1 GBP equal to 90.17 INR. Let us also say the carpet exporter from India is able to sell 500 carpets per month to the UK importer. The total revenue earned by the Indian exporter of carpets as a result of this is 247.20 pound sterling per carpet into 90.17, which is the Indian rupee equivalent, multiplied by 500, which gives him a total sales revenue of 11.145 million rupees. Let us also say the cost of manufacturing a carpet for the Indian manufacturer is 12,960 Indian rupees. So multiply that by 500, you would get a total production cost of 6.48 million. The operating profit, therefore, given these factors, is 4.665 million for the Indian exporter, which is arrived at as a difference between the sales revenue of 11.145 million and the cost of manufacturing of 6.480 million. Now, in this column, let's examine some of those assumptions. As things stand, the two are equal. I'd like you to focus on the numbers that are given here in red. The only change we would make is inflation in India goes up to, shall we say, 10%. The minute that happens, you will find the change in the production cost of the carpet. It has gone up from 12,960 Indian rupees per unit to 13,200 Indian rupees per unit, which means the total production cost goes up from 6.480 million to 6.60 million. In effect, therefore, the operating profit for the Indian exporter of carpet goes down from 4.66 million to 4.54 million. Now, this reduction is exclusively because of a factor that is completely beyond his control, which is an increase in the inflation rate in the country from 8% to 10%. There could be other factors that affect this relationship between the Indian exporter and the British importer. Let us say, for example, for competitive reasons, the British importer demands a reduction in the price of the carpets because of competitive reasons. And let us say the new price is 240 GBP per carpet. Now you will see that the profit margins of the Indian exporter, obviously as a result of the reduction in the price per carpet, goes down from 4.54 million to 4.22 million. Furthermore, again, let us say for competitive reasons, the volume that he can sell to the British exporter goes down to, shall we say, 450. That means a 10% reduction in his sales volume. This takes the profits further down to 3.798 million. So what we started with, 4.665 million, is now come down to 3.798 million for a combination of three reasons. The inflation in India went up to 10% from 8%. The price per carpet for competitive reasons came down from 247 to 240, and the sales volume, again for competitive reasons, came down from 500 to 450. Now this, as you can see, is a combination that has seriously impacted the operating profit of the Indian exporter. The second example we are going to look at is a case of a utopian exporter exporting to an importer in the United States. Let's understand the base case. The quantity exported per month is 100, obviously 12 months in a year. The price in domestic currency. Now the big difference between this and the previous example is the utopian exporter will be invoicing in his domestic currency and the price per unit is 400. Now given that reality, his total turnover or total revenue per annum is 480,000, which is arrived at as 100 into 12 into 400. The prevailing USD CCU exchange rate is 50. Now the other difference in this example vis-a-vis the previous example is the fact that there is an imported component in the finished product of $2, and therefore at the current exchange rate of 50, $2 imported component, the cost of the imported material is 100. In addition to this 100, there is an operating cost for the producer in Utopia of 250, so his total manufacturing cost is 100 plus 250, which is 350, and so his total cost of manufacturing is 100 into 12 into 350, which gives him a figure of 420,000 CCU per annum. His operating profit is 60,000 currency units, arrived at as 480,000 minus 420,000, which would give him an operating profit of 60,000 currency units. Now let's look at the situation when the USD CCU exchange rate changes to 54. That is, the CCU depreciates and therefore the exchange rate now is 50 to 54. What does this do to the profitability of the utopian exporter? His cost of import goes up from 100 to 108. His operating cost remains the same and his total cost goes up from 420 to 429.6, which means his operating profit drops from 60,000 to 50,400. It's important to note that the American importer is at a tremendous advantage because of this, because whereas earlier his cost of importing was 8, now his cost of importing is only $7.41. All the loss arising from this depreciation of the CCU therefore has been taken by the utopian exporter. The utopian exporter is not happy with this situation and therefore he approaches the American importer to renegotiate the terms. There is very little either of them can do in terms of the exchange rate. So they could renegotiate the price from 400 to, shall we say, 405. Now as a result of this, the profitability of the utopian exporter has gone up from 50,400 to 56,400. In other words, the American exporter in a collaborative mood has said he will buy at 405 instead of 400 as he was doing before. In addition, the American exporter, let us say, agrees to increase the quantity that he was willing to buy every month. Let us say the US importer and the utopian exporter agree that there is room to increase the quantity exported per month, and let us say it goes up from 100 to 107. What this does, as you can see, restores the profitability of the utopian exporter, which was 60,000 originally, which fell to 50,000 because of the depreciation of the CCU. Now, by adjusting the quantity and the price, his profitability has been restored to very close to 60,348. What is even more interesting for us to note is, whereas the American importer, it was costing him $8 per unit, despite all of these concessions that he has given, he still is able to import at $7.5 per unit. So both win. They have managed operating exposure very, very effectively. The examples that we just saw in those spreadsheets clearly suggest that operating exposure is manifested through a variety of factors. These include the invoicing currency, the inflation rate, the input prices, the elasticity of demand, the operating cost, the market power of the buyer or the seller, and the reaction of competitors to the above factors. A combination of those factors makes managing operating exposure a huge challenge. Some firms use more sophisticated techniques like regression analysis to estimate the sensitivity of their future cash flows attributable not only to exchange rate fluctuations but several other variables, including interest rate fluctuations, commodity price fluctuations, etc. As would be obvious by now, operating exposure is more complex because A, it pertains to cash flows that might not be contracted for yet, and B, it is impacted by a whole host of variables, perhaps triggered by an exchange rate fluctuation. Therefore, operating exposure could potentially have a more complex and a more serious impact on the margins and the market value of the firm than transaction exposure, which, as you will recall, is impacted only by exchange rate fluctuations, and that too on its contracted cash flows. Hence, unlike transaction exposure that can be hedged using forward contract, options contract, etc., managing operating exposure is a far more complex task because it could also have long-term implications for the organization. In fact, if we look back over the last 20 years, it would be obvious that persistence of operating exposure has resulted in a competitive strategic response by several multinational companies, particularly from the United States, which include local sourcing in the country where the products are sold. A good example of that would be Walmart, IKEA, and so on. Shifting manufacturing to countries where the demand exists, shifting manufacturing to countries where the cost of manufacturing is lower, and so on and so forth. That brings us to the end of our discussion on operating exposure as well as on managing foreign exchange risk.